everybody. Welcome to our first WTF webinar of 2025 on the future of transportation. I'm Matt Carmichael, the founding editor of What the Future, and your host for today's episode. This is our 48th issue of What the Future, and we are no stranger to the topic of transportation. We've been talking about transportation in various contexts since one of our earliest issues back in 2018, which gives us some interesting perspective. In those early days, Elon Musk and just about everyone else were predicting that we'd have autonomous cars. They'd be pervasive and safe enough to sleep in by 2019. Did the pandemic mess up that trajectory? Maybe a little, but mostly the tech wasn't ready for full prime time, although you can get an autonomous taxi in places like Phoenix. But people weren't ready for it either. What do we mean by that? Well, we hate to say we told you so. Nah, we're kidding. It's fun to say we told you so. In that first issue, we posited that there could be a car culture war. Ipsos' Cliff Young wrote that nothing divides Americans more readily than rules and regulations, and the first time someone is denied access to something they have previously taken for granted, we will have a political uprising on our hands. At the time, we were speaking more about autonomous vehicles, but in the meantime, electric vehicles have emerged as a major political front, and Ipsos' Future of Transportation study shows that people think that's going to get worse, not better. It was a big campaign topic in the 2024 presidential election, as President Trump suggested, wrongly, that Vice President Harris wanted to, wait for it, regulate that all vehicles be electric. In battleground state Michigan, the implication was that such regulation would lead to the end of the auto industry, as we knew it, along with its jobs. A shift to EVs opens up career fields, even as some are lost. You'll need fewer oil change mechanics, but there'll be more careers in batteries, power storage, technology and infrastructure, construction to support those changing needs. Part of the car culture is that cars equal freedom, and one impediment to that feeling is traffic. Any depiction of the future you've ever seen, up until Star Trek's beaming transporter, has starred at least one aspect of the present: traffic. Whether people are using jetpacks, hoverboards, AVs, e-bikes, shared scooters, they're likely to be surrounded by a lot of other people doing the same. After all, transportation is about moving people and moving stuff. So what could reduce traffic in the future? You can reduce the number of vehicles due to increased use of safe, timely, reliable, and pleasant transportation. Or you can reduce the time spent on the road, which would either mean needing fewer reasons to move. That could be due to remote work, virtual socialization, climate change making being outside unpleasant, or you can build better cities that allow for more walking and alternative forms of transit and density. Those are the options, and realistically, we're going to need both, and neither is easy. Now, what would make traffic worse? Many things. Adding lanes and building more roads. Google induced demand if you need more about that. Poor urban planning, increased population, increased online shopping, failure to invest in trains and public transportation, undoing certain environmental regulations and incentives, relying on the gas tax for infrastructure funding, climate change literally melting infrastructure, return to office policies and other factors. You'll note that list is much longer and harder to solve than the Make It Better list. And part of the traffic problem is misaligned incentives. State departments of transportation, DOTs, are often funded by a tax on gas. Progress is measured in vehicle miles traveled, which has increased for decades. To reduce traffic, DOTs need incentives that lower that number. And climate change policy and transportation policy are basically the same thing, as we'll discuss later. Now, what can history teach us about the future? If you look at the infrastructure of Pompeii, streets were built on a grid that was easy to understand and navigate. Some were closed to traffic to make safe pedestrian boulevards. Chariots were built to standard widths and clearances, and that allowed for these elevated stepping stone-like crosswalks with enough room for the wheels to pass between. Sewage was funneled into the streets and eventually washed out to sea, so builders made ways for people to cross without having to dip their sandals into the filth. Now, what do these practices have in common? They're all related to human-centric design. Now, people are also making economic trade-offs when it comes to transportation and other policies. Insurance costs more. Vehicles cost more. partially because they're rolling battery-powered computers at this point. Fuel costs are uncertain. More cars now require a subscription to access popular features that people used to just pay for once up front, like remote start, navigation, and entertainment. If people subscribe to, say, Apple Music through their car maker rather than directly, how could other businesses bundle subscriptions and related offers or services with the car as a platform? Who pays and how for all the deferred maintenance of our aging infrastructure? Taxpayers whine about increases, but older taxpayers, especially, paid artificially low taxes for decades that maintenance was deferred. Now those bills are coming due with interest, and the roads and bridges are literally collapsing around us. The money to fix what we have, let alone invest in forward-looking infrastructure, is going to have to come from somewhere. Climate change will not make that better, my friends, as anything from pavement rail to railroad track to switches are literally melting. So where does all of this leave you? Probably with some big questions, like how do we build a more resilient supply chain? Will AV trucks make up for the looming shortage of drivers? Is it possible to have more e-commerce and less traffic? Will businesses or consumers bear the cost of shipping in the long run? Will delivery drones really become a thing? What kinds of garages will people need in the future? How will commuting change? What will in-car marketing look like? And one big wild card, what influence will Tesla CEO Elon Musk have in the new Trump administration? Transportation also equals time, and if people are spending more, or maybe ideally less time in traffic, what happens to all the other demands on our time? That was a lot of questions. Do I have any answers? Some? Always keep the humans at the center of your plans. It worked for Pompeii up until the volcano, and it could work for you and your city, your brand, your product. Realize that how we'll get from place to place will change, but our desire to connect with others, explore, and move stuff will remain fundamental human needs. Spend some time thinking through scenarios based on that litany of questions on the previous slide. There are many plausible futures there, and they'll have an impact on whatever you do for a living as you go about living your personal lives too. And we can help with that. Because in the end, your customers, or their customers for our B2B friends, are people who move and buy stuff and store that stuff and transport it. Many like driving, and they're not all sold on auto-related subscriptions. Most are strapped with cash, and every dollar they spend in one category is a dollar they don't have to spend in another. However, the many like driving point has also been changing for a bunch of reasons. The number of teens getting their driver's license has been falling for decades as social patterns change, costs go up, and graduated driver's license requirements have become stricter, taking a lot of the freedom out of driving. There's a shift where driving doesn't equal freedom for kids who can socialize virtually to some degree. And today, about a quarter of younger Americans say their vehicle reflects their personality, but that number has dipped since we first asked it in 2017. This shift contrasts sharply from our past car culture. Now, for a weekend in August, classic car enthusiasts gather in Detroit for the Dream Cruise, where they drive their showy cars up and down Woodward Avenue, which was the first paved road in the US. They visit the haunts of yesteryear like Hunter House, a fantastic hamburger joint. But gone are the heydays of road tripping along Route 66 with its kitschy drive-in theaters and dive motels. So will the future of transportation be a functional one, or one that rekindles our love of transportation, or both? For every sector, all of these trade-offs are going to have an impact. As always, we have a ton of data and a great panel lined up to talk through these issues. So let's get this show on the road. So today, to talk through the future of transportation, we have Jen Brace, the Chief Futurist of Ford Motor Company, Justin Ballack, the State Program Director at Evergreen, Andy Moses, Senior Vice President, Solutions and Sales Strategy at Penske Logistics, and Katie Irie, the Senior Vice President of Product Design from Allstate. It's going to be a great discussion. Stay with us. The auto industry has pivoted hard to meet upcoming state and federal standards for electrifications, which may now start to change again. And as someone once said, there really is no future that centers on using fossil fuels to move thousands of pounds of metal every time you want to leave the house. But customers haven't all jumped on the EV bandwagon. President Trump has vowed to undo a lot of the progress on these issues, and the head of one of the largest EV manufacturers will wield an unknown degree of influence in shaping policy. That trifecta opens up several disparate, plausible scenarios. Ford has invested in revitalizing a decrepit train station in Detroit, transforming it into a research and development space for the automaker and the community. It's a futuristic space rooted in the past, which is an apt metaphor for both Detroit and for Ford. Before the election, I spoke with Ford futurist Jen Brace. She's monitoring signals from transportation, but also from everything from climate change to alternative proteins. She's found it challenging, however, to think about the future and focus on how to power it. We talked about all the ways Ford is working to move toward an electric future. Part of that is assuaging people's concerns about AVs, more on that in a moment. Part of it is selling people on all of EV's benefits. And part of it is working with cities and other stakeholders to build out all of the infrastructure needed. But part of it is also the humans. Here's what she told me.
We check in with people and ask how they're feeling about technology, because it's one thing for companies to understand the capabilities of technology and where it can go and what it can do, but that really only moves the needle if consumers are accepting of that technology. So recognizing where they're at in either, number one, how can we ease concerns if they're having concerns about it, or how can we support them along their journey? Just as critical is making sure that the technology is where it needs to be, because it's not enough to just have it. It's recognizing where consumers are willing to integrate it into their lives. And if there are concerns or there are hurdles that they're not ready to get past, how can we support them on that journey? How can we give them some choices or give them some options along the way and make it easier for them, especially if it's something that we see as particularly important or valuable? Then we're working together to build the future, if you will, recognizing that it's not just going to happen because we're selling something.
I love that quote so much, I'm tempted to play it again. It's such an important point, and it's one I try and make in WTF fairly frequently, that in order for tech to succeed, people have to want it. It has to solve a problem or align with a value. In short, you've got to get the humans on board. As I said, an influx of investment and tax incentives have emboldened US auto brands to pin their hopes on the future of demand for electric vehicles. But that demand isn't growing fast enough, while it is growing, to meet expectations. In large part because automakers haven't fully reckoned with the barriers to EV adoption, says Patrick Sheeposh, an EVP in Ipsos' automotive practice. With weakened consumer spending, fierce competition from overseas, and challenges developing software-defined vehicles, US auto brands are under pressure. Some have turned to plug-in hybrids in hope of easing drivers into EVs, but this approach loses sight of the real problem: shortcomings in the consumer experience. I mentioned that Ford is taking steps to get customers on board with EVs. That includes talking up the positive features, removing barriers with a program to install EV chargers in the homes of folks who buy certain models, and more. That's addressing several of the pain points and complaints flagged in Ipsos' research, particularly about poor battery life, inadequate charging infrastructure, over-the-air updates, and high initial purchase and repairs costs, all of which undercut the actual benefits of EV ownership. By identifying and addressing these issues, all auto brands can build a strategy that centers their customers in product development, to marketing, and delivers on their needs. Transportation is both a cause and a symptom of the climate emergencies. According to the US EPA, their economic sector accounts for the highest share of greenhouse gases, and our roads, bridges, and rail tracks are literally buckling from extreme climate shifts. Justin Balick works to align transportation policy with climate goals at the climate policy nonprofit Evergreen. When he thinks about the future, he's thinking about the convergence and scale. Justin and I talked about how climate policy and transportation policy are intertwined, and what that means when each incoming administration tries to undo the work of the previous administration as quickly as possible, at least at the federal level. And he said that experts across the spectrum all expect the strains on our aging infrastructure to be exacerbated in coming years. Solving and funding those solutions is going to take working with governments at all levels. But one particular level might be especially helpful. Here's what he told me.
I've started calling state DOTs the next frontier of climate advocacy. There's a real movement building. There are climate forward governors in a lot of states that are members of the Climate Alliance. Lots of states have specific transportation emissions goals, and we know that electrification and reducing vehicle miles traveled is a big part of that. Advocates and labor unions and industry stakeholders all have a role to play in aligning the transportation policy, governance, funding regimes in states to be more in lockstep with climate goals and climate commitments. And I think that's going to happen by necessity because we also know that the transportation system is underfunded everywhere. When people are coming up with alternative funding streams like climate impacts and sustainability goals have to be part of the conversation because eventually the gas tax is going to be on its way out. Number two, we've seen that state DOTs are now in the business of building out the charging network. They are literally the recipients of the NEVI funding and have to figure out how to do all the RFPs and work with the private sector to get all these charging stations out the doors. And now it's incumbent upon the climate movement, climate advocates, stakeholders in the space to really work with policymakers to turbocharge that conversation.
One especially local form of transportation has been on the rise for years. Bikes, e-bikes, and scooters offer a sustainable means of local transportation while easing road congestions and air pollution, says Joanne Lynch, director with Ipsos Public Affairs Practice. While just 4% of Americans say their household owns an e-bike, 8% plan to buy one in the next 2 years, and 23% would consider a future purchase, per Ipsos polling. Infrastructure improvements like separated bike lanes and bike paths and financial incentives would be the two most important factors for potential e-bike riders, especially those ages 18 to 34. But the hard part might be raising awareness of those efforts. Today, only 3% of Americans have heard of the E-Bike Act consumer tax credit, while 90% of Americans don't know if their state has rebates or incentives for e-bike purchases. For policymakers, this signals a need for targeted public education campaigns and strategic investments that consider safety, equity, and user behavior. Expanding infrastructure and offering tax subsidies could significantly boost e-bike usage, reducing traffic and carbon emissions. Transportation isn't just for people, it's for stuff too. But even that comes back to people. From waiting on home deliveries to managing business supply chains, we're all affected by shipping snags. And the logistics industry faces climate issues and outdated infrastructure, but also a very particular human problem: disruptive driver shortages. Andy Moses from Penske Logistics sees tech innovations like AI and sharing economy inspired networks as potential game changers. For businesses, this could mean fewer half-filled trucks and more cost-effective shipping and better package tracking. He chatted with managing editor Kate MacArthur about how brands need to understand how critical data is in keeping their supply chains agile, but also having the right systems to leverage all of that data. But back to those human problems. The driver shortage is real and not likely to get better. He thinks we'll see autonomous trucking take off, at least for interstate travel, if not the last mile just yet. That will take the insurance industry, political forces, and the business community coming together to solve the other side of that human coin: getting people comfortable being around those vehicles. This seems to be a recurring theme, doesn't it? Finally, he sees one other big change coming in the next several years. Here's what he told Kate.
I believe we are going to see the sharing economy continue to advance and mature. So just like we have Airbnb and Uber and things like that, I think we'll see the elimination of wasted capacity in the transportation sector through more sharing, which is going to be good for the environment. It's going to be good for the economy. And if we're putting our investments in the right place, I think it's going to be good for Penske Logistics. Right? As all those trucks going down the road, they ain't all full. And so we have a lot of upside in our in transportation and in supply chains to leverage that capacity better. We're already doing it, and I think we'll find ways to continue accelerating that. The best thing we can do for the environment is to move the material with fewer miles. It's the most direct payback. It takes carbon emissions right out of the equation. It doesn't reduce them, it eliminates them. And we have a lot of upside in that respect, I believe.
One of the things that will impact the future of transportation, from how much we drive as consumers to the B2B trucking and logistics side of things, is how much of our shopping is online, which requires the stuff we buy to be brought to our homes. As Americans do more of their shopping online, businesses in every sector need shorter lead times and faster order fulfillment. Innovations in digital logistics systems and real-time tracking have the potential to help companies keep up with those demands. But even the most advanced tracking infrastructure will be counterproductive if it's not easy to use, says Peter Mackey, an EVP in Ipsos's user experience practice. Too often, shipment tracking systems are held back by unintuitive or overcomplex interfaces, when they exist at all. To unlock the full potential of their data and make their operations future-ready, businesses must implement user experience best practices into their systems from the start. Brands can gauge their UX performance on functionality, ease of use, learnability, user fit, and other criteria. Improvements on those fronts won't just keep them or help them keep tabs on payment errors and delivery delays. Better UX can also unlock growth opportunities by streamlining complex procedures and simplifying access to information, boosting efficiency and transparency. As they face pressures to stay agile and manage complexity, the companies that invest in UX will have an edge over companies stuck with clunky and outdated systems. Finally, we turn to a topic near and dear to my heart. I'm a Detroiter who grew up in the epicenter of car culture. Sorry, Italy and Germany and Japan and China. It's true. I'm also the parent of 3 teenagers, and I've been researching this topic for more than 15 years. The car's role as a symbol of adulthood and identity in American culture is waning among younger adults. Only 24% of 18 to 34-year-olds believe their car greatly reflects their personality, down from 30% in 2017. Young drivers are taking longer to get behind the wheel, too. Katie Irie, a senior vice president of product design at Allstate, tracks these and other shifts since insurance protects our prized possessions. When she thinks of the future, she says the industry must redesign insurance to match our changing needs. She and Kate talked about the various factors that play into why fewer kids are getting their licenses than in the past. One frequently cited culprit is the rise of technology, which enables kids to hang out virtually without having to move around physically. Urbanization plays into it, but then she zeroed in on what I've often felt is the unseen cause of this: graduated driver's license requirements. Here's what she told Kate.
States with the stronger graduated driver licensing laws have the largest reductions in fatal crashes among 15 to 17-year-olds. So they are really important. Kids don't have as much freedom as they used to. Within the graduated driver's licensing laws, they have to put in the hours of supervised driving. There are nighttime restrictions. There are passenger restrictions. So certainly those things change how teenagers are driving. And teenagers a lot of them are nervous about driving. They say is one of the reasons why they don't get their license right away. They have plenty of other options available now. It used to be just like a bicycle or a car or your feet. Now you can, particularly in metropolitan areas, you can hail an Uber, you can pick up an e-bike. There's so many different options that are readily available, and they're less risky, and they have lower fixed costs than purchasing a car, paying for maintenance, paying for insurance, all the things that come with that. The cost is obviously high for driving and owning a vehicle. The benefits may be less. So that's where I think the technology advancements that we've seen over the last couple of decades play into it. Before smartphones, your driver's license really represented responsibility and freedom. Now we have that constant connectivity with your smartphone. So the responsibility remains. The degree of freedom that comes with that responsibility is less. Teens are maybe not thinking about this actively, but that risk return trade-off has changed. compared to what it was in the past.
Tech and economic factors are part of the change in teen driving behavior, but I think these requirements are a big underrated part of it. And sitting in a driver's ed seminar for my teenager, I learned one thing that really kind of drove that point home for a lot of the parents, which is that if there is a graduated curfew, for instance, that teenagers aren't allowed to drive past 10 o'clock at night or something, at 10:01, they become an uninsured motorist. Think about that. And starting in the late 80s and early 90s, the baby boomers ushered in a host of state-by-state restrictions on when and with whom teenagers can drive. And it was done to protect their millennial kids, and that totally worked. But there was a second order impact too, which is, as we've been talking about, fewer kids driving. But with all the new safety features being built into cars, can we maybe find a new balance in the future? Of course, one of the reasons kids aren't driving is a problem for adults too, which is money. Insurance, especially for kids, is crazy expensive and can be hard to navigate. Auto insurance policyholders want more than just lower premiums. They're demanding better online tools, streamlined processes, and improved service as well. And as rates rise, they're more willing to shop around to find a provider that delivers on these needs, says Jeff Pace, an SVP in Ipsos's consumer experience practice. The challenge isn't limited to any one industry. From inflation to supply chain challenges, a range of forces is driving up the cost of consumer goods and services and pushing Americans to think twice about the value they get from what they buy. At the same time, new technologies are shifting how services are provided and measured. To differentiate themselves from their competitors and keep their customers from defecting, businesses must ensure they're creating a seamless experience, online and offline, and no matter their sector. New market research tools can help both by enabling businesses to gather feedback on the customer experience and by guiding them as they translate those insights into better experiences. With an understanding of value perceptions, loyalty drivers, and competitive positioning, brands can build customer relationships strong enough to outlast the temporary pain of price increases. Now, when we're thinking about the future of a topic for What the Future, we'd like to think about it in terms of some of the tensions that underlie and will drive change in the future. And this is a pretty standard tool used in foresight, and we create these kind of 2x2 grids imagined in the future. But the joy of doing foresight in a market researcher is we can see where we are today and how far we'd have to move one way or another to shift to a different kind of future from our baseline continuation sort of scenario. So the first we will look at today is the tension of convenience versus climate versus cost. And in the top right, in today's world, we'll take convenience and cost over climate by quite a bit. So while clearly the climate needs some prioritization, it might be hard to get to a future in the lower left quadrant, say, where climate wins these trade-offs. So what can brands and policymakers do to bring down costs, increase convenience, and make it so these choices don't even have to be made? And in tension 2, we talk about the enjoyment of driving versus tax incentives for EVs. And again, in the top right, the world we live in isn't a great one. We're stuck driving. We aren't aligned with government incentives to make our vehicles more climate friendly. And if this continues, we'll likely see continued but slow adoption of EVs and continued but rising climate challenges. Autonomous technology could put the foot back on the gas if it takes off. But an autonomous future will also require investment at all government levels. So how likely is that? But as you can see, we are much closer to the origin here, making all of these futures pretty potentially within reach. So why do we do all of this? Why do we do What the Future? Why do we present this to you free and openly? And the answer is that when you get to step back, even just taking a half hour over lunch to listen to a webinar, or doing a full-on foresight project to really imagine the power of these scenarios for your organization. When you get to stop and think about the future, put yourself 3 to 5 to 10 years ahead of now. Think about the world that your customers and your stakeholders will live in and what that world looks like. You start to think about the kind of products and services you'll need to innovate in order to get there. You'll start to think about what kind of messaging you'll need to make that happen. And in short, when you imagine possible tomorrows, you ask better questions today. So thank you all for joining us and giving yourself some space to think about the future. It's the new year, and that's always a good time to be doing that. Coming up, we have issues on the future of persuasion, the future of fandom, and the future of pets. And well, we don't have the full calendar yet, so you'll have to stay tuned a little further.